Ukraine just did something that defense analysts said was impossible. After 2 years of brutal attrition warfare, after Western weapons packages that arrived too late and in quantities too small, after Russia fortified every meter of occupied territory with mines, dragon's teeth, and defensive lines that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, Ukrainian forces have reached the borders that existed before February 2014. Not the 2022 invasion line, the 2014 line. That includes Crimea. Maps from independent satellite verification confirm what Kyiv has been showing for the past 72 hours. Ukrainian troops are now positioned at geographic coordinates that have been under Russian control for over a decade. This was not a negotiated settlement. This was not a frozen conflict that got unfrozen through diplomacy. This was a military operation that has fundamentally rewritten the strategic calculus of this entire war. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications because what I am about to walk you through is not just a battlefield update. This is the story of how a country that was given weeks to survive has just accomplished what the entire Western intelligence community assessed as strategically unattainable without direct NATO intervention. I am going to show you exactly how Ukraine pulled this off. We are going to examine the specific operational decisions that made this possible, the weapon systems that proved decisive, the intelligence failures that left Russia unable to respond, and the geopolitical consequences that are already reshaping European security architecture. By the time we are done, you will understand why what just happened in Eastern Europe represents the most significant territorial reversal in a conventional war between two major military powers since 1945. Let me start by establishing why this matters beyond Ukraine. Since February 24, 2022, the operating assumption across NATO capitals has been that Ukraine could potentially survive, could potentially stabilize defensive lines, could potentially inflict enough casualties to make continued Russian aggression prohibitively expensive. What was considered beyond realistic possibility was the full restoration of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, particularly Crimea, through military means. The peninsula was assessed as strategically unassailable. Russia had spent a decade fortifying approaches, had established the Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol, had integrated Crimea into Russian logistics networks so thoroughly that separating it would require capabilities Ukraine simply did not possess. That assessment just became obsolete. The operation began not in the east, but in the south. On March 3, 2026, Ukrainian naval drones executed coordinated strikes against the Kerch Strait Bridge, but this time with a critical difference. Previous strikes had targeted the bridge itself, attempting to sever the physical connection between Russia and Crimea. This strike targeted the rail junction on the Taman Peninsula side, not to destroy the bridge, but to isolate it. Simultaneously, Ukrainian forces that had been conducting what appeared to be diversionary operations in Zaporizhzhia Oblast executed a rapid mechanized thrust toward Melitopol. Within 18 hours, they had bypassed Russian defensive fortifications that intelligence assessments suggested would require weeks to penetrate. How? They did not penetrate them. They went around them. Here is where Western military doctrine and Ukrainian tactical innovation diverged in ways that proved decisive. NATO planning for offensive operations against prepared defensive positions emphasizes suppression of enemy air defenses, establishment of air superiority, systematic degradation of defensive infrastructure through precision strikes, followed by combined arms assault. Ukraine did not have air superiority. Russia's integrated air defense network, while degraded, remained functional enough to contest Ukrainian airspace over occupied territories. What Ukraine had was something that proved more valuable in this specific operational context: perfect intelligence on where Russian defensive positions actually were, where they were undermanned, where logistics choke points created vulnerability, and where geography created opportunities for rapid exploitation. Ukrainian intelligence had spent 18 months mapping every Russian position in southern Ukraine with a level of granularity that exceeded what Russia's own commanders possessed. This was not satellite imagery. This was human intelligence developed through resistance networks, signals intelligence from intercepted Russian communications, and tactical intelligence from drone surveillance refined over thousands of sorties. Ukrainian planners knew which sectors were held by elite Russian units and which were held by mobilized conscripts with inadequate training. They knew which positions had functioning artillery support and which had been stripped of indirect fire assets to reinforce other sectors. Most critically, they knew which approach routes Russia considered improbable and had therefore left lightly defended. The breakthrough came through terrain that Russian defensive doctrine classified as impassable for mechanized forces. Ukrainian engineers had been studying the hydrology of southern Ukraine's river systems for months. They identified a 2-week window in early March when water levels in the Malaknaya River would be low enough to permit fording by properly prepared vehicles at specific crossing points. They pre-positioned bridging equipment at locations 15 kilometers from the actual crossing sites, moved it into position under cover of darkness using routes specifically chosen to avoid Russian drone surveillance patterns, and executed crossings at 4 points simultaneously. By the time Russian reconnaissance identified the crossings, Ukrainian mechanized battalions were already through and exploiting toward objectives 20 kilometers behind Russian lines. This gets to a fundamental reality about modern warfare that Ukraine has demonstrated with brutal effectiveness. Defensive lines are only as strong as the logistics that sustain them and the reserves that can respond to penetrations. Russia had constructed impressive fortifications, but those fortifications were static. Ukrainian forces moving at 40 kilometers per hour through breakthrough zones were inside Russian decision-making cycles. By the time Russian commanders identified where the main effort was actually occurring, Ukrainian forces had already bypassed strongpoints, were interdicting Russian reinforcement routes, and were creating conditions where Russian units faced the choice between fighting encirclement or conducting hasty withdrawals that exposed them to devastating strikes from Ukrainian artillery and drone-dropped munitions. Within 72 hours of the initial breakthrough, Ukrainian forces had advanced 60 kilometers and reached the outskirts of Melitopol. Russian forces defending the city faced an impossible tactical situation. Their supply lines ran through territory now under Ukrainian fire control. Attempting to hold the city meant accepting encirclement. Withdrawing meant abandoning prepared positions and conducting a retreat under conditions where Ukrainian forces had achieved local superiority in reconnaissance, fires, and maneuver. Russian commanders chose withdrawal, and that decision had cascading consequences across the entire southern front. Let me show you what happened to Crimea in the week that followed. The Kerch Bridge, now isolated on both sides by Ukrainian interdiction of rail and road networks, became strategically irrelevant. Russian forces in Crimea were not cut off entirely. They still had maritime supply routes through the Black Sea, but the volume of supplies that could be moved by sea was a fraction of what the rail link had provided. More importantly, Ukrainian strikes using Neptune anti-ship missiles and naval drones began systematically targeting Russian naval logistics in Sevastopol. This was not an attempt to sink the Black Sea Fleet, which had largely relocated to Novorossiysk months earlier. This was methodical destruction of the port infrastructure required to sustain a garrison of 40,000 Russian troops, plus the civilian population that Russia had settled in Crimea over the past decade. Russian forces in Crimea required approximately 1,500 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat capability: food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies. Maritime logistics could deliver perhaps 800 tons per day under optimal conditions, and conditions were far from optimal. Ukrainian maritime drones had established what amounted to a blockade, not a complete blockade, but enough harassment of Russian shipping to drastically reduce throughput. By March 15th, Russian garrison forces in Crimea were operating on quarter rations. Artillery fire rates dropped by 70% due to ammunition conservation. Vehicle movement decreased dramatically as fuel reserves dwindled. Ukrainian intelligence knew all of this because they were reading Russian logistics communications in real time. When Russian commanders in Crimea requested emergency aerial resupply, Ukrainian air defenses were pre-positioned along flight corridors. When Russia attempted to reinforce by sea using landing ships, Ukrainian naval drones were waiting. The siege of Crimea was not conducted through direct assault on prepared positions. It was conducted through the methodical strangulation of the logistics that made Russian presence sustainable. On March 22nd, Ukrainian forces crossed into Crimea proper. They did not cross at the narrow Perekop Isthmus, where Russian defenses were strongest. They crossed at 3 points along the northern coast using amphibious capabilities that Western intelligence had not realized Ukraine possessed. These were not Western-supplied amphibious assault vehicles. These were civilian ferries and barges that had been modified with improvised armor and configured to carry Ukrainian mechanized infantry across shallow waters. The crossings were conducted at night, were supported by electronic warfare that blinded Russian surveillance radars, and achieved complete tactical surprise. Russian forces attempted to respond, but they were responding from positions that had already been degraded by 3 weeks of logistics starvation. Artillery batteries that should have interdicted the landing zones lacked ammunition. Armored units that should have counterattacked lacked fuel. Russian air power that should have dominated Ukrainian forces on open beaches was suppressed by Ukrainian air defenses that had infiltrated into Crimea with reconnaissance teams days before the landings. Within 36 hours, Ukrainian forces had established a perimeter 20 kilometers deep and were advancing on Jankoy, the critical logistics hub that connected northern Crimea to Sevastopol. Now let me address the question every analyst is asking. What about Russian nuclear threats? Since 2022, Putin has repeatedly signaled that attacks on Crimea would constitute attacks on Russia proper and could trigger nuclear response. Ukraine just conducted the most significant military operation on Crimean territory since 2014. Russia's response was conventional military resistance, which is collapsing, and rhetorical escalation, which is being ignored. What changed? What changed is credibility. The first time Putin threatened nuclear use in response to Western weapons deliveries to Ukraine, it produced caution in Western capitals. The fifth time Putin made similar threats, it produced less caution. The 15th time, it produced no caution. Russia has discovered what every state that relies on nuclear threats eventually discovers. Threats that are never executed lose coercive power. Ukraine calculated, correctly it now appears, that Russia would not initiate nuclear war over the loss of Crimea because the costs of nuclear escalation would exceed any conceivable benefit Russia could obtain. China has made clear that nuclear use would end Chinese support. India has signaled similar positions. Even Belarus has quietly communicated that it would not support Russian nuclear escalation. Putin faces a choice between accepting a humiliating conventional military defeat or initiating a nuclear exchange that would leave Russia an international pariah facing economic consequences that would make current sanctions look trivial. Ukraine bet on Russian rationality, and that bet is paying off. But here is what makes this genuinely consequential beyond the immediate military situation. European security architecture is being fundamentally rewritten in real time. For 30 years, the operating assumption has been that borders in Europe could not be changed by military force. Russia violated that assumption in 2014 and again in 2022. The Western response was economic sanctions and military assistance, short of direct intervention. What we are watching now is Ukraine demonstrating that borders can indeed be restored by military force, which changes the calculus for every territorial dispute in Europe and beyond. Baltic states have spent a decade wondering whether NATO Article 5 guarantees would actually be honored if Russia manufactured a crisis in their Russian-speaking regions. What Ukraine just demonstrated is that with sufficient military capability and political will, occupied territory can be liberated without triggering World War III. Indeed, dest in one's tree. That has implications for how Baltic defense planning proceeds. It has implications for Polish security policy. It has implications for how Finland and Sweden, NATO's newest members, think about deterrence and defense. Beyond Europe, this is being watched with extraordinary attention in East Asia. Taiwan has spent 70 years under the assumption that successful amphibious assault against prepared defenses is nearly impossible without overwhelming force, and that even if liberation were militarily feasible, the international community would prevent it through diplomatic intervention. Ukraine just conducted successful amphibious operations against a nuclear-armed adversary, and the international community's response has been to provide additional weapons and intelligence support. Chinese strategists studying Ukraine's Crimean operation are drawing conclusions about Taiwan scenarios that will influence PLA planning for years. Russia's strategic position has deteriorated beyond anything Western intelligence anticipated. Loss of Crimea is not merely loss of territory. It is loss of the Black Sea Fleet's primary base, loss of Russia's ability to project power into the Mediterranean without Turkish permission, loss of the symbolic victory that Putin used to justify his entire Ukraine policy, and loss of credibility with domestic audiences that have been told for a decade that Crimea's return to Russia was irreversible. Russian military performance in this operation has exposed systemic failures in logistics, command and control, tactical proficiency, and strategic planning that will require years to address, assuming political will exists to conduct the necessary reforms. Ukrainian forces are now consolidating control over territory that extends to the 2014 borders. They are conducting demining operations, restoring civilian infrastructure, and establishing administrative control. Western governments that spent 2 years debating whether to provide tanks are now debating whether to provide reconstruction assistance. The speed of this shift from existential threat to liberation is producing policy whiplash in multiple capitals. What comes next depends on decisions being made in Moscow right now. Does Russia accept the loss of Crimea and seek negotiated settlement that preserves some face-saving elements? Does Russia attempt a renewed offensive from positions in occupied Donbass? Does Russia escalate to attacks on Western logistics networks supporting Ukraine? The range of Russian options has narrowed dramatically, and none of them are good. Ukrainian strategic success has created a new reality. A country that was not expected to survive has not only survived but has conducted the most successful conventional military offensive in Europe since 1945. The weapon systems that made this possible were not wonder weapons. They were relatively modest capabilities employed with tactical proficiency, operational imagination, and strategic clarity about achievable objectives. The intelligence that enabled this was developed through hard work over many months. The political will required to execute this came from a leadership that understood their survival depended on victory, not negotiated settlement. The intelligence dimension of this operation deserves special emphasis because it reveals capabilities that reshape assumptions about modern warfare. Ukrainian intelligence services have been underestimated throughout this conflict, dismissed as inferior to Russian counterparts with Soviet-era pedigrees and decades of operational experience. That assessment is now obsolete. Ukrainian intelligence penetration of Russian military communications is so thorough that Ukrainian commanders were reading Russian orders before Russian units in the field received them. Ukrainian human intelligence networks inside occupied territories provided targeting data with precision that exceeded satellite reconnaissance. Ukrainian signals intelligence intercepted and decoded Russian encrypted communications in real time, allowing Ukrainian electronic warfare units to jam Russian command networks at critical moments during the offensive. This intelligence advantage was built systematically over 2 years of warfare. Ukraine invested heavily in signals intelligence capabilities with Western assistance, deploying sophisticated collection systems that monitored Russian communications across electromagnetic spectrum. Ukraine recruited and trained intelligence officers who understood Russian military culture, doctrine, and procedures, because many had served in Soviet-era forces or trained alongside Russian counterparts. Ukraine established resistance networks in occupied territories that provided human intelligence with granularity that no technical system could match. The result was an intelligence picture so complete that Ukrainian operational planning could exploit Russian weaknesses with surgical precision. Western intelligence agencies provided critical support, but not direction. American satellite reconnaissance identified Russian defensive positions and tracked Russian unit movements. British signals intelligence shared intercepts of Russian communications with strategic value. Polish intelligence facilitated logistics and provided border support for Ukrainian operations. But the integration of this intelligence into operational planning was Ukrainian, and the execution was Ukrainian. This demonstrates that intelligence effectiveness is not just about collection capabilities, but about the ability to integrate intelligence into decision-making processes that produce operational results. The weapon systems that enabled Ukrainian success were not exotic or experimental. Ukrainian forces used Soviet-era tanks that had been upgraded with Western optics and communication systems. Ukrainian artillery used a mix of Soviet and Western systems with ammunition supplied by multiple nations. Ukrainian drones were commercial models modified for military use alongside purpose-built military systems. Ukrainian infantry used small arms and anti-tank weapons from diverse sources integrated into combined arms tactics. What made these weapons effective was not technological sophistication, but tactical proficiency in employment and operational imagination in how capabilities were combined. This has profound implications for defense procurement and military planning globally. The assumption that modern warfare requires the most advanced technology available is being challenged by Ukrainian demonstration that older systems employed with tactical skill can defeat more modern systems employed poorly. This does not mean that technology is irrelevant. Ukrainian success would not have been possible without the precision that Western optics provide, without the communications security that modern encrypted systems enable, without the reconnaissance that commercial satellites and drones deliver. But it means that technology is necessary but not sufficient. Training, leadership, unit cohesion, tactical proficiency, and operational art remain decisive even in technologically advanced warfare. Ukrainian logistics performance also merits examination. Moving tens of thousands of troops with vehicles, ammunition, fuel, and supplies across 60 kilometers in 72 hours, while under potential Russian air and artillery attack required logistics planning and execution at levels that many Western armies would struggle to match. Ukrainian logistics officers pre-positioned supplies along planned routes, established redundant supply lines to ensure that interdiction of one route would not halt the offensive, coordinated civilian transportation networks to move supplies that military trucks could not handle, and maintained operational security that prevented Russian intelligence from identifying logistics concentrations as targets. Russian logistics failures compounded Ukrainian logistics success. Russian units that attempted to reinforce forward positions discovered that their supply lines had been interdicted by Ukrainian forces operating in their rear areas. Russian fuel depots were struck by Ukrainian missiles and drones before Russian forces could access them. Russian ammunition stockpiles were depleted through months of artillery expenditure without adequate replacement. Russian commanders faced tactical situations where their units lacked the fuel to maneuver, the ammunition to fight, or the supplies to sustain defensive positions. These failures were not accidental. They were the result of systemic weaknesses in Russian logistics doctrine, corruption that diverted resources from military purposes, and Ukrainian operations designed to exploit Russian vulnerabilities. The political dimension of this operation extends beyond Ukraine and Russia. European nations that have provided military and financial support to Ukraine are assessing how this outcome affects their security calculations. If Ukraine can defeat Russian military forces through a combination of Western weapons and Ukrainian tactical proficiency, then the threat that Russia poses to NATO members is less severe than many assessments suggested. This could influence European defense spending, force structure decisions, and alliance posture. Conversely, if Russian defeat in Ukraine produces Russian political instability or desperation that increases risks of escalation, European nations will face different challenges in managing relationships with a wounded but still nuclear-armed neighbor. The economic consequences of Ukrainian victory are already manifesting. Reconstruction of Ukraine will require hundreds of billions of dollars in investment. Western nations and international financial institutions are developing frameworks for this reconstruction that will reshape Ukrainian economy and potentially integrate Ukraine more thoroughly into European economic structures. Russian economic isolation will deepen as sanctions remain in place, and as Russian reputation as unreliable partner discourages future business relationships. Global energy markets will adjust to a world where Russian energy exports face permanent reduction in European demand and where alternative suppliers capture market share that Russia will not recover. The precedent that Ukraine has established regarding territorial integrity and the use of force will influence conflicts beyond Europe. Armenian-Azerbaijani disputes, Georgian territorial issues, Moldovan concerns about Transnistria, all of these frozen conflicts are being reconsidered in light of what Ukraine has demonstrated about the possibility of reversing territorial losses through military action. The international order based on prohibition of territorial conquest by force was already weakened by Russian actions in 2014 and 2022. Ukrainian success in reversing those conquests does not necessarily restore that order, but it demonstrates that aggression can be defeated and reversed, which changes calculations for both potential aggressors and potential victims. If you want to understand how the global security environment just changed fundamentally, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are covering the NATO summit response next, and what we are learning suggests that alliance defense planning is being rewritten based on Ukrainian lessons learned. This is not just about Ukraine anymore. This is about what becomes possible when conventional deterrence fails and states decide they will fight for end of script.